Good morning. It's nice to see the sun out there shining after getting the rain that came through last night. It woke me up. I was encouraged with what I saw yesterday. We had a work day and a cleanup day here. And I guess I was one of the first ones to come through here. I was handed a task to do back here in this little room. And I opened that door there and I heard little voices. So I peeked around the corner over there. And there was about 4 or 5 of our youngest in here acting like they were having church. And that's the generation that this class is about, to try and preserve what we can for their liberty and their abilities to worship the way they like to practice as they see fit. Last week, we kind of ended up on just touching on how slavery came to be in America. It has been a blight on the world. It has been a blight even on this country. It still exists today in the world. Some of those that do not appreciate our history and our founding, though, make the false claim that slavery lasted in this country because of our form of government in the Constitution did not recognize certain classes of individuals as equals. And that's not true. I gave you the example of the actual first legal slave owner last week was actually a black indentured servant that had served his time of labor, one of the first 20 people here that was brought over here from Africa, and was offered the same deal of indentured servitude, had actually completed his time of service and was actually had their own plantation of fields where he had even had his own indentured servants. And of course, after filing a false claim in the court system and winning a case in court, and actually had a judge declare the first legal ownership of one man by another in this country. Of course, that existed under British rule. We were still a British colony then. But there was also a misconception that slavery, while slavery might have ended when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but that was not the first such proclamation that was made. Can you imagine what our worship would be like if the history of the apostles had been erased and the disciples of the first century? If we didn't have that, that's a majority of what our New Testament is, that history. Well, our historians have tried to do the same thing for the large contributions that was made for freedom in this country by what we would call minorities today, and especially black men and black women's contribution to freedom in this country. And not just that, but also to try and wipe away the history of the contribution of women in this country. When the feminist movement says, women's always been held down under the boot of their husbands, that they never did anything great in this country. But I've got some examples of both that's going to show that's not the case. But their history, their contribution is stolen by those people. when they try and erase that history, to rewrite it for political means. As bad as slavery was, America was one of the first countries to work throughout the world to try and abolish it. It was not an easy thing to overcome, even in this country. And while we don't lock people up with chains as slaves today, the same mentality exists, the same results exist, the same control over people exists. And even the history is being tried to rewritten on, well, who were those people that were so pro-slavery? We know it was in the South, was the strongest, but it was not the only people. A slave had a roof over their head. They were given food. They were given some basic form of health care. They were given the basic necessities of life, barely, most of them. But there were many of them, many slave owners that actually treated their slaves with dignity, even educated some. We're going to learn a little bit about one of them. But I make that point to say this: the same things that were provided both to those that were very abusive slave owners still provided those basic necessities. Now, to the extent that, we would not tolerate such today, to see somebody treated the way they were treated. At least I would hope not. Yet, we witness the same thing today by the same party today. You can watch the news and hear how, I heard just this last week a quote from, I can't remember the representative's name, but he knew better than to make the quote he made. He said, if it wasn't for the Democrat Party, black men would still be slaves and they wouldn't be able to vote. They wouldn't have had the civil rights movement. Yet there's a little problem with history with that. If you go back during the civil rights movement and look at the legislation that was introduced, what party introduced the legislation?
The Republican Party.
What party voted 0 to give those rights or acknowledge those rights to the white man? Well, it was a black Democrat man that made that comment.
A lot of misinformation in the world.
Look at the cities in the United States. There are certain cities in this country that are ran, majority of the government of it is either Democrat or Republican. Some of the worst cities that I can think of that I would definitely not want to live in are New York, Detroit, Chicago. I mean, there's a long list of them. Care to guess which party has been in control for 100 years in those cities? The Democrats.
They care about the working man.
Yes, they do.
They feel our pain.
We have a new movement. There's a new Democrat Party led by a younger generation of socialist Democrats. Does anybody remember what party was the party that came to power, rose like a meteor in Germany in the early 1930s?
Socialist Nazis.
What promises did they make?
Same one we're hearing today.
We'll take care of your health care. You're not being paid enough. You ought to have equal wages. We'll take care of you. The history that we've seen for 700 years before that It's the exact same history, over and over. When tyranny reigns is when we as a people lose sight of the fact that we are ultimately, we hold the authority for our own good, our own lives. Nobody else is going to look after us like we will. But we also have the power to give that up, barter it. We'll give you this benefit if you'll just not recognize some of your rights. We'll take care of you and keep you safe. The same promises were going on in the 1700s in this country. Anybody ever heard of Frederick Douglass? He was born on a Maryland plantation in 1817, somewhere in there, because there was not an accurate record, because he was a slave. He was born a slave. He, I guess, had a drive from within to want to learn, to be more than just a slave, to be free. He found ingenious ways to learn how to teach himself how to read and find those that would be willing to teach him how to read. From the kids that he played with on the plantation, the white kids. He would, I don't know if you'd say trick them, but kind of got them to help teach him how to read. And he would gather up pieces of paper to practice to learn how to read. He would read newspapers till somebody would see him reading and snatch it away from him. Because, an educated slave can't be controlled as easily. Neither can an educated citizen. He became a great orator, a great writer. All because of his own self-determination. Actually, one of his quotes is, "Knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom." And while he was doing this, he actually got to where he learned enough from the Bible. He would find torn pages out of Bibles in the gutters and wash them and clean them so he could read them. And actually got to the point where he would preach. They finally allowed him to preach to the other slaves on the plantation until neighboring Democrat plantation owners were incensed that their slaves were learning to read, as this made it harder to control them. So one Sunday, slave owners from the surrounding Democrat plantations burst in with clubs and dispersed Frederick's small congregation. And Frederick's owner sent him to a slave breaker who whipped him regularly, nearly breaking him psychologically. And after an abrupt confrontation, the slave breaker never tried beating Frederick again, because Frederick's owner rented him out to caulk shops in the shipyard. So he later became a licensed preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And at 23 was an accomplished public speaker. He went on to meet and inspire another famous writer, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a black lady that wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which that's one of the ways that they like to make derogatory remarks to people, especially people of color that have educated themselves up enough to come out of the plantation. So they call them Uncle Toms to try and deride them. You see the same kind of derogatory remarks in public made today of people. I can remember hearing comments like that made of Condoleezza Rice when she was made National Security Advisor. Well, you'd only got that job because you're an Uncle Tom. It's tragic.
Amen.
It's unchristian.
That's right.
It got to the point to where even, because the Democrat South was Christian, right? These were Christian plantation owners doing this. So Frederick Douglass was frequently accosted by the Democrat mobs, even having his hand broken, which never healed properly. In 1845, Frederick Douglass published his autobiography, which became an instant bestseller. In it, Douglass condemned hypocritical religious slave owners in the land of the Democrat South, but clarified that he supported true Christianity. I find, since reading over the foregoing narrative, that I have, in several instances, spoken in such a tone and manner respecting religion as may possibly lead those unacquainted with my religious views to suppose me an opponent of all religion. To remove the liability of such misapprehension, I deem it proper to append the following brief explanation. This is the language of a prior slave. What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slaveholding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Sorry. You could say the same thing of those that promote abortion.
Amen.
Frederick Douglass stated, I am a Republican, a black, dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and I never intend to belong to any other party than the party of freedom and progress. Many notable black authors have observed how modern-day dependency on government handouts is reminiscent of the dependency that existed on Southern Democrat plantations, where slaves waited for handouts from their masters. And in this article, there's a long list of other writers that have contributed such for the writings to help encourage black slaves then to educate themselves and to leave the plantation. Another black hero to this country. Has anybody ever heard of Crispus Attucks? Crispus Attucks was the first adult, I would say American, to give his life for liberty. He was not the first person to die for liberty in our revolution. Does anybody know who was the first to die? I have forgotten their name. If they ever gave it, I'm not so sure they did. I'm sure it exists somewhere. But it was a young man of about 11 years old. And it had to do with helping spark the Boston Massacre, in which Crispus Attucks was part of. It was a week to 2 week long buildup of tension between the British soldiers and certain citizens at the docks there in Massachusetts that led up to this. So Crispus Attucks was born around 1723. His father was likely a slave and his mother a Natick Indian. And he was, of course, one of the first 5 to fall in the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. The details leading up to that, depending on what news sources you listen to or read, like today, there's a lot of sources out there that will put out the fake news of what happened. So you really have to look through a lot to get down to what really is actually known and what was speculative. Well, during that time, the British soldiers were not paid very much. So they liked to try and get local work to help supplement their income. Well, Crispus Attucks had escaped the plantation and had made his way to the docks in Boston, where he was a rope maker and worked on a ship. Well, during this time, liberty was on the minds of a lot of people there. Again, they've been going through 10 years of petitioning the British government for recognizing their liberties, even to the point to where the children would get in on the gig sometimes, so to speak. This is after the Tax Act and the Stamp Act and all of those, where they were taxing the necessities that I had mentioned, and the tea in particular. Well, some of the store owners who were liberty-minded, they've already made a big investment. They've already bought all this tea, had to pay for it. Well, they didn't want to just lose their money on it, so some of them were still trying to sell it, the tea that everybody was boycotting. Well, this particular store owner, known as being kind of a buffoon, had a group of kids out front of his store that was making fun of him. They had made a sign that said something to the effect of, he's still selling the tea, and had a picture of a hand pointing at his store. And they'd call him names and throwing pebbles at his storefront, just making fun of him and all that. Well, it got him all upset to where he went out there trying to wrestle the sign from the hands of these children and couldn't get the sign even away from the children. They made him look just silly. So then he decided to close up shop and went home. Well, they followed him all the way home, making fun of him, mocking him. He gets home, slams his door, and the kids are outside. You can hear them from outside, catcalling him. And then, kids, one of them somewhere found a bunch of rotten food, so they're throwing rotten food at the door. So the man's wife comes out, and she's getting bombarded with rotten food, trying to get him to leave. So he comes out with his gun, hollering at them, telling them to leave. And they wouldn't do it. He said, if you don't leave, you're going to be sorry before the sun goes down. Well, kids, that just stirred them up even more. So he arbitrarily fired his rifle towards the mob. And an 11-year-old young boy who was just walking down the street was hit. Well, happened to be the same day, that night, that these soldiers had been at the docks asking for jobs, and the rope maker that Crispus Attucks worked for said, yeah, I'll give you a job. You can clean my bathroom, so to speak. Which ticked him off, made him mad. So he picked a fight. Well, that soldier got beat up pretty bad. He went, he got 7 of his buddies come back, thinking, we're going to whip these rope makers. So the rope makers whips all 7 of them. So they leave. They come back with 40 soldiers. The rope makers put them in the wind, so to speak. Well, a couple of days later, this thing happens. And Crispus Attucks hears about it. And he gets a group of sailors, and they go to confront the soldiers. And it ends up in gunfire. Somebody throws a rock, a bottle, whatever, at the soldiers, and of course they start shooting. 5 people are hit, and Crispus Attucks is one of the first that's shot and killed. There's actually even a poem written about him for standing up against the king for liberty. And about one of the ladies that we're going to get to talk to about, hopefully, her name was Mercy Otis Warren, who became a writer. And about slavery, she wrote an article. And this was in 1788. It says, "The immediate gift of the Creator obliges everyone to resist the first approaches of tyranny, which at this day threaten to sweep away the rights for which the brave sons of America fought." And she's not just talking about the white sons of America. She's talking about the black sons of America too. "Behold the insidious efforts of the partisans of arbitrary power to lock the strong chains of domestic despotism on our country, to save us from anarchy on the one hand and the jaws of tyranny on the other." So similar promises are made today, We promise you to save you from anarchy. But in order to do so, we have to act tyrannically. She wrote that in 1788. So Crispus Attucks is forever known as the first man to die in the fight for liberty in this country. So all too often we hear claims about original intent of the Constitution. We understand original intent because we apply that too, biblically speaking. When we want to learn, what are we as Christians supposed to do for worship? How do we become a Christian? How do we live as a Christian? The term original intent is another way for us to say, going back to the Bible, what the Bible says. Well, the same can be applied to the original intent of understanding the Constitution. So often we hear the claims that appointing an original intent judge will bring back the Jim Crow and slavery. But a reasonable look at history, which is not to be expected from those dedicated to maintaining an activist-based judiciary, should give rise to the opposite conclusion. A Supreme Court of the United States justice who follows original intent should be viewed as a safeguard against a racist court. If you will read to the end, you will understand what I mean. The infamous case of Scott v. U.S., otherwise known as the Dred Scott decision, was not an example of original intent, but of judicial activism. In Scott v. U.S., the Supreme Court, through a series of historical errors, ignorance, and racist reasoning, wrongly declared that the Constitution never intended to make black men citizens and therefore intended for them to be property. They ignored the history of freed blacks in America, ignored the drafter's own words, and inserted meaning into the Constitution's text that could not be found in its plain reading. Because also, from the founding, there were blacks that owned lots of property. They owned businesses. Guess what else they did? They voted. You don't hear that talk very much, do you? They were very an intimate part, at least in some parts of the country, in our early growth as Americans. So the court's judicial summary of the Dred Scott case is rich with historical revision and falsehoods and demonstrates the court's venture outside of the text. The court claimed the only two clauses in the Constitution which point to this race treat them as persons whom it was morally lawful to deal in as articles of property and to hold as slaves. Of course, there are no clauses in the Constitution that identify the African race. This was read into the text by the racist court. The clauses in question reference persons who are other than free persons and a person held to service or labor. This could equally apply to over 300,000 English, Irish, and Scottish slaves brought to the American colonies between 1618 and 1775. Yet we do not hear the racist Dred Scott court, or any other person for that matter, attempting to argue that an Irishman, Scotsman, or poor white English slave would not be a citizen if freed, that their children, if born free, would not be citizens. Again, this racist court, not the Constitution, falsely claims a free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. This lie is then expanded by Justice Daniel in his concurrence when he says, "Now the following are truths which a knowledge of the history of the world, and particularly of that of our own country, compels us to know, that the African race never have been acknowledged as belonging to the family of nations." This, of course, runs contrary to the fact that Great Britain treated freed black men as citizens. In 1653, one of the first legal cases brought before the British courts regarding the permanent institution of slavery was brought by a black man named Anthony Johnson, who was a citizen, property owner, and slave owner, claiming his slaves were not indentured but permanent property. Prior to this case, most slaves were indentured and could complete their term of service or purchase their own freedom, making them freemen and citizens. The scourge of chattel slavery, which is what that court case led to, slavery spread rapidly after this decision, and it grew to be a central character of this diabolical trade. Yet there were many freed slaves who were treated as citizens in the American states during and after our war for independence. These men and women fought for our independence. They owned property, they created businesses and charitable organizations. They were considered valuable members of society. Look to the history of Crispus Attucks, George Middleton, Lemuel Hayes, or James Forten, to name just a few. You have to wonder why those who want to celebrate black heritage refuse to acknowledge those freed black men and women who helped fight for and found this nation. You know, a lot of those heroes, the only free breaths they ever drew were for fighting for liberty. In the modern wave of racial division under the guise of defending equality, it is conveniently ignorant that most of the state representatives in convention opposed the continuance of the slavery. A small number of slave states, capitalizing on the founders' fear of not building a strong union to withstand future assaults by Great Britain, bullied the convention. They forced the convention into compromising on the slavery issue, deciding to sunset slavery instead of end it immediately. Far from celebrating this compromise, many founders like James Madison regretted that they did not face the situation and end it then and there. In 1787, George Mason, also known as the father of the Bill of Rights, suggested, "This infernal traffic originated in the avarice or greed of British merchants. The British government constantly checked attempts of Virginia to put a stop to it." So this notion was not an isolated view, as evidenced by the Massachusetts judge in the Quock Walker case of 1773, referring to the alleged slave laws, that they had been considered by some of the provinces to be laws as actually existing among us, but nowhere do we find it expressly established. It was a usage which took its origins from the practice of some of the European nations and the regulations for the benefit of trade of the British government respecting its then colonies. But whatever usages formerly prevailed or slid in upon us by the example of others on the subject, they can no longer exist. Now, the racist courts in Dred Scott could have easily referred to the Walker judge's more accurate assessment. And I quote, "And these sentiments led the framers of our Constitution of government, by which the people of this Commonwealth have solemnly bound themselves to each other to declare that all men are born free and equal, and that every subject or person is entitled to liberty and to have it guarded by the laws as well as his life and property. In short, without resorting to implication in constructing a constitution, slavery is, in my judgment, as effectively abolished as it can be by the granting of rights and privileges wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence. The court are therefore fully of the opinion that perpetual servitude can no longer be tolerated in our government, and that liberty can only be forfeited by some criminal conduct or relinquished by personal consent or contract. Even Thomas Jefferson suggested that it was not the initial choice of the colonies to participate in slavery, but a mandate by their then government of Great Britain. The abolition of domestic slavery is a great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibitions and by imposing duties which might amount to prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty." Thomas Jefferson, July 1774. So it was an issue that they wanted to put to rest early in this country. But there was 2 or 3 states that would refuse to ratify the Constitution under that situation. So as a way of compromise, it was tabled for another 20 years at least. There was another point that just went in and out of my head. But one thing to note, the call today when we have a constitutional crisis is what? Well, we have to get the Supreme Court to tell us what's right and what's wrong. They didn't get it right here. They're human. So just because something comes from a court doesn't mean that it's going to be right. We suffer from easily accepting information based on what source it comes from. Because, well, if a policeman or a judge or a representative says it, it must be true and accurate, right? No. Well, the Bereans, when the apostles told them about the gospel, even had miracles in their view to prove the validity of their message, they still did what? Went back and verified what they heard, if it matched the scriptures. We should do the same thing when we hear our representatives and our judges and our law enforcement talk about laws. But when's the last time you even glanced at the Constitution to know, well, is that really what's in there? Because there's many times in history that even our judicial system gets it wrong. Sometimes it's by accident and ignorance. Sometimes, though, it is out of pure evil.
1973, an evil court that said a woman can murder her baby because it's her body, her choice. There's nothing in the Constitution that grants a woman the right to murder her baby. They just made it up.
Right.
And now we're still beholden to the decree of those judges.
Well, we allow ourselves to be.
Yeah.
When a court, and that's one way they've got us to believe in this. They say a court rules. Well, kings make rulings. Courts issue opinions on the case in front of them. Roe v. Wade, the opinion of that court really only had legal authority over that case between those two people. Yet, when Kavanaugh had the hearings for being appointed as Supreme Court Justice, he was asked by a lot of people, how will you make your decisions? Does anybody recall ever hearing him once say, I'm going to make my decisions based on the Constitution? He never said it. His answer was, well, I'll have to follow precedent. Well, historically, in 600 years, the history we went over, what was one of the tactics that tyrants used to take control of the people? They corrupted the courts, right? How do you corrupt a court system? Especially if you've gotten them all to buy into, well, we have to follow precedent. So you get a corrupt judge to make a corrupt ruling. Now, what's the others say? Well, yeah, we'd like to go by the Constitution, but we have this precedent of Roe v. Wade, so it's the law of the land. It's not right. But we allow it to be made the law of the land when we allow them to do that. Legally speaking, that case and the opinion of it only affected those two people. There's a Supreme Court in the Korematsu v. U.S. also that is still on the books, that it was constitutionally okay to intern Japanese Americans in the 1940s. Justice Roberts, when all of this has been brought up during the confirmation hearings of Kavanaugh about precedent, Justice Roberts says, oh, we've taken that off the books. Well, it doesn't go off the books just because a judge says it does. There have never been a case for them to offer an opinion that removes that from law. That is still a binding legal judgment of the Supreme Court of the U.S. Any other comments before I appreciate y'all's attention. Next week we'll be having Philip speaking. The week after that will be, I guess, the Easter weekend, so we'll have all kinds of visitors. I may or may not deal with this subject with so many people visiting, but the next time I do, I hope to get to deal with some of the women that history has forgotten and their contributions to our country. Thank you.